So we'll have a brief word of prayer, if you'll join me, and then we'll get on with it. Lord, thank you for this evening and just a beautiful day, a chance to come and worship together as we should. And help us to realize that the past is, well, it's a record of what we need to emulate and what we need to avoid. And help us not to be so foolish as to think the past doesn't speak to us today. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, most of what you see, we lickety-split at the last minute, got the handouts. Did you?
No, sir.
Okay. Together. These cover a lot of what we talked about last week, and thanks, Bill. And where we'll kick off tonight. There are a couple of things that you're going to have to try to help me with as we go on with this. Church history, there are many things going on in different places at the same time. And there's no way I can, because I'm not smart enough, there's no way I can tie all that together at the same time. So some things we're going to have to see through to a conclusion, and then we will rewind the time clock and go back to another location and see that through. Okay, because if I don't do that, it becomes awfully confusing. Very early on in the church fragmented into different areas, and three areas in particular grew to be centers of Christian activity. There was no Vatican. There was no central church. They all worked together. They were all equals. They were all peers among each other. And they looked at themselves as all, as they should, as all members of one body. Nobody had authority, so to speak, over everyone in the church. That didn't exist early on. Last week we talked about, and you can glance at your handouts if you want, we talked about how the church spread. And what I did is I didn't steal them. They are free. But the illustrations that I included, you'll see a map of the trade routes along the Mediterranean. You'll also see a map of the eastern trade routes. And also, I think there's a map of the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews. And you'll see how similar they all are. When the Jews dispersed, they followed already ancient trade routes. These had been established for over 1,000 years, in some cases 2,000 years. So this wasn't just a willy-nilly leaving of Jerusalem or Israel and Judea and just scattering. There were settlements, there were highways, there were roads, there were caravan trails. And they naturally followed those to get to whatever location they chose to live in. So when the church came along, they did the same thing. Now at Pentecost, we talked about this last week, at Pentecost, these men that were delivered of the Holy Spirit dispersed throughout the Roman, at that time the Roman Empire, following those same routes. And they carried what they had learned and many had seen with them. So when the apostles finally started going out, they were going out more to cement the theology rather than to plant churches. Because merchants, travelers, slaves had already cemented or planted the churches, or at least dropped the seeds. We know that because everywhere Paul went in his missionary journeys, he met Christians. They were already there. They were already there, well before him. Now, one of the first controversies that came up, and our friends that are deacons will be interested in this. In Acts 6:1, we're told that now in those days when the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists, because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. And we know how they went ahead and selected 7 to serve. Okay? Same thing as deacons. They selected so that 12 could continue to teach. Now the question is, who are the Hellenists? Now we talked a little bit about this last week. Oh, by the way, I don't know who's responsible for this. But I'm just tickled pink.
Carolyn, Carolyn, our secretary, I think.
Carolyn will hear from me. I'm in hog heaven.
She asked me if there was anything we needed, and I said, yes, David needs.
Bless
red
your
wine."
heart.
And she was going to Sam's that very day, so that's
There's
why I said
There's
that.
every color in the rainbow in there, so we're going to have some fun over the next few
You
weeks.
said you were pink, so. Careful what you say there.
Yeah,
You're pink.
around Brian anyway. The church in Jerusalem, remember, there were no non-Jewish Christians at this time. So when there was a conflict between the Hebrews and the Hellenists, what does that mean? There weren't any Gentiles. The Hellenists that they're talking about in Acts, that Luke is talking about, are the Hebrews who had been Hellenized, who had become more cosmopolitan, who had accepted Greek culture, maybe even Greek dress and Greek customs, that sort of thing. They were still Jews. They belonged to the synagogue. They belonged to the temple. But they were saying that because they weren't Jewish Jews, their widows and their people that needed food distributed to them were being neglected. So that was the first schism, if you will, between those who felt like they were accepted in the church because they were true blue Jews, and those who were the great unwashed, those Jews who lived differently. Now they took care of that. They said, okay, look, we're going to go ahead and appoint some people to take care of that, to see that it's done equally and properly. Something else that's important to realize about these first Christians, they did not establish a new religion. They did not go off on their own, although they did do some things differently that we'll talk about. But basically, they continued to worship in the temple with the other Jews. They were not establishing a new religion. They were Jews. And what had they been promised all through the Old Testament? Through the law and the prophets?
Messiah.
A Messiah. Exactly. They were Jews who were now living in their minds in the Messianic age. The Messiah had arrived so that the completion of Judaism, or the completion of the promise, was what they were living for and living in that time period. But they did not become Baptist. It was not a separate thing. They still went to the temple. They still met on the Sabbath. They still honored the feasts and various things that every other Jew honored. They were not establishing a new religion. They were celebrating the coming, or they were celebrating the arrival of the Messiah. Problem was, as we well know, the traditional Jews, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the zealots, the Essenes, some of the other Jewish groups, were not expecting that, because they had long since stopped understanding what they had been given through the law and the prophets. They were looking for a secular ruler, like David, to come in and get rid of the Romans. In the early church in Jerusalem, authority rested in the 12. You remember who took Judas's place?
Start with a B.
Um,
Am I close?
it wasn't Matthias, who was called Nathaniel, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's in here.
Yeah, it's in there. But anyway, they were 12 again. All the authority, and what I mean by authority was if there was ever any question about what Jesus taught, forget all the other fluff, but what Jesus said, they went to the 12. Why? Because they lived with him for 3 years. They knew. Not only did they live with him for 3 years, but he selected them. He personally chose those 12. Well, aside from Nathaniel, Matthias, aside from him, he chose those men to carry his word forth. So if ever there was a controversy, well, I think this means that. Ask one of these guys. Because they know. Now later we're going to see, when controversies came up about what should be included in the Bible, and nowadays a lot of people make a hoopla about that, what should be included in the Bible and what shouldn't be and so forth. This was the determining factor. Did one of them write it? Or did one of the writers serve with one of them? In other words, was everything included in the New Testament apostolic? If it wasn't included. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but just so that you know, there was a determination eventually, and this is 300-400 years down the road, of what would be official. But fundamentally, what was included in the Bible is what the church had been using as gospel for 100 or 200 years before they got to naming it the New Testament and putting it all in a book. The church, the people of the church, which is the church, had accepted everything that was considered apostolic as gospel. Everything else, the Apocrypha that's included in the Catholic Bible, and we'll talk about that later too. All of those things may have been used if they had some wisdom in them, or if they had some good ideas for living and moral ethics and that sort of thing, but they were never considered gospel. Never in the church. Now again, we'll get to that later because it will come up again. But the basic 12 had all authority. Of particular importance, Peter, James, and John. Everywhere in the New Testament that you find that Christ went off to do something, or Christ had something to say, or during the Transfiguration, these guys were around. These three guys. Don't know why. I don't know why they were singled out, I have no clue. This James was not John's brother James. There are a couple of Jameses that are in the New Testament. John had a brother James who is also a disciple. But this is James, they called him James the Younger. I don't know why. I guess he was younger than somebody. But they called him James the Younger. Those three, and even Paul in Galatians chapter 2 verse 9, called them the pillars of the church. Okay? Now, very early on, because of this split in the Jewish church, at first, very first, the synagogue allowed these followers of Jesus to worship with them. They figured they were a pain in the rear, but they still let them come to temple and celebrate the feast and that sort of thing because they were still Jews. But very early on, they started to be persecuted. And we find in Acts as well that I don't know how much time had gone by, not much, I don't believe, but Stephen was martyred. It wasn't long after that James, the half-brother of Jesus, who had become the head of the church in Jerusalem, he was martyred. Herod Agrippa had him killed. And by the way, there's kind of a rabbit trail. Can you imagine anyone that would be more unaccepting of a uniqueness than a sibling? In other words, if you tried to get your brother or sister to believe, when you were kids anyway, that you were special, how much luck do you think you would have had with that? I don't know, maybe you had particularly loving siblings, I don't know. So you may not be able to understand. But James was a younger half-brother of Jesus who grew up in the house with him. Nobody would have been more unaccepting of their big brother being special than someone who had grown up with him. Yet James and another brother, Judas, were not, and maybe all of them, were not only converted, but James was so adamant about what he had seen. He had spoken to his half-brother after he had died. We were told that he rose, and after he rose, James is one of the people he appeared to. That James rose to be head of the church in Jerusalem. I think that's fascinating to me. It's more evidence that Christ actually is who he says he was, or who we believe him to be. The persecution became more fierce and widespread, to the point where the Christians, Peter, we know the stories. Peter was arrested, he escaped the first time, and all these various things went on. But behind the scenes, the Jews were becoming agitated again. There was a Jewish rebellion every 50 years or so. The Jews themselves were starting to be agitated. In 66, in the year 66, they openly revolted. And all of that started again to the point where, by 70, what happened in 70?
That was the dispersion. Tearing down the temple.
The second, yeah, it was another dispersion, to be sure. In 70 AD, a Roman general named Titus was sent, and he destroyed Jerusalem. And since it was, and more particularly, the second temple, Herod's temple. And today, if you go to Jerusalem, even after 2,000 years, today if you go to Jerusalem, the only thing remaining is the Wailing Wall. You've all seen pictures of the Wailing Wall with Jews praying and sticking notes in the wall and so forth. That is supposed to be, I don't know, I wasn't there 2,000 years ago, but that is supposed to be the only remaining section of the temple, which leads me to believe that when I say they destroyed the temple, they destroyed the temple. I mean, they razed it to the ground. And indeed, Bill, Jews followed those same routes, and they dispersed yet again, because there was no reason to stay in Jerusalem. There wasn't anything there. As a result of that, we're not going to be able to see it on there. As a result of that, I get to draw a hot dog. Now, that is not an amoeba for anyone that sat in through the first class. That's the Dead Sea. The River Jordan runs roughly up like this. Jerusalem sits over here. On the other side of the Jordan, like south-southeast of Jerusalem, is a city called Pella. When the temple was destroyed and persecution had become so fierce, the Christian church moved from Jerusalem to Pella. Now, Pella was a secular city. It wasn't populated by Jews. I'm sure there were some there because of the proximity. But it was basically a secular city full of pagans. At first, the Romans didn't worry about the Christians that much. Didn't pay too much attention. Just another group of Jews. But after the destruction of Jerusalem, and they had reestablished themselves here, the Romans started to think, wait a minute, we just put down a rebellion, and these folks say that their Messiah is going to come back. He is of the line of David, and they knew who David was, and that another king will come back and reestablish David's kingdom. So the Romans started paying more attention to them, and of course anywhere else they had dispersed. The funny thing is that over a period of time, when James was martyred, the head of the Jerusalem church, a gentleman named Simeon took over the church and led them to Pella. When they established themselves here, Simeon was tracked down, and he was also martyred. What's really interesting about Pella is over a period of time. Now here, you don't have anything but desert for the most part. The Christians that removed to Pella started to absorb into their faith pagan ideas from the tribes and the folks that lived around them. Unlike other Christians throughout the Western and Mid-Eastern world, they did not have contact. They had been cut off effectively. So they could not grow and thrive like the rest of the Christians scattered around the Mediterranean basin. these folks were cut off, and in fact, 300 years later, 400 years later, they died out. They completely died. And I think it's ironic that the original church, the first church, was the one to die. And it had gotten to the point where a couple of hundred years after Christ, some of the early church fathers like Irenaeus and so forth mentioned these Christians, but only as an afterthought and only with like jokes, because they were uneducated, paganized Christians. But that's what happened to the original church. They're gone. Now, as I said, prior to this, there were only Jews in the church. In fact, the only mention we have of a non-Jew is Philip's conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch, okay, that took place, excuse me, and apparently he was accepted, because we're not told that he wasn't. Apparently he was accepted, but up to that time, there were no other Gentiles in the church. Now again, it's important to point out that this is not terribly good, and I apologize for that, but this is the boot of Italy, this is Greece, this is Turkey, this is like Syria, would be here, and then down into Jerusalem and on across North Africa. It follows pretty much the same as your dispersion or trade route maps. Now these are where the Christians scattered. And remember, long before missionaries got here, other people had planted the seeds of the church. Okay? There were three main areas of influence: Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch, and we hear about Antioch a lot in the New Testament, and Rome. And you can see how widely dispersed they are. And there were congregations all along this. In fact, we'll learn later that Christians in North Africa were very plentiful and very strong at one time. And Alexandria was a very powerful center of the church. What happened is very different. Go ahead, Al.
on.
Let's.
Keep going, or
No. This is a good place. This handsome gentleman here is the Emperor Nero. Now, the legends are plentiful about Paul and Peter. We're not going to deal with legends. The facts are that both Paul and Peter ended up in Rome. And both of them were martyred by Nero. Now, whether they were in there at the same time or not, I don't know. There isn't anything in writing that says they were, so your guess is as good as mine. There are also intimations, because in Spain, they have a very strong root in Paul having gone to Spain and cemented the church. And Paul mentions that he wanted to go to Spain. And there is a time frame where he may have done that. We don't know. We don't know. So controversy about that, if it's not in the Bible, doesn't matter. But the fact is, this gentleman, what happened, and you've all heard Nero fiddled while Rome burned and all that. Nero, back in those days, the way an emperor left his mark was by building. Herod, by the way, Herod the Great, had done the same thing. He built some beautiful cities in what was then Palestine. Caesarea Philippi on the seacoast. Not to mention the Second Temple. He was amazing, but that was the way, and tying into what Rob talked about, that was the way they left their legacy. so that people would remember them long after they left. Problem is that the people in Rome, where he wanted to build, didn't want to move out. Didn't want to give up their homes. The Roman Senate did not want to approve the funding for his pretty aggressive building projects. So oddly enough, one night, Rome caught on fire. And I mean, a lot of it. Because unlike what is left now, not everybody lived in a marble house. We have the Colosseum and the ruins, and Jeannie and I, we haven't been to Rome, but we've been fortunate enough to see a lot of that. That, of course, didn't burn. The interior would. But most people lived in normal homes. 3/4 of Rome burned. And many of the people in the know at that time openly, well, not too openly, but left in writing that Nero did it because he wanted that property to build on. However, he knew that even in Rome, because by this time, Caesars were coming as popular as you could change them like your socks, and it became more so as we go on in history. He knew that he was not protected if it got to be public knowledge that he burned it. Now, did Nero burn it? I don't know. I wasn't there. But the consensus was that he did. However,
Just so.
just so, 3/4 of Rome burned. Guess who lived in the quarter that didn't?
Nero.
No, well, yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, his palace didn't burn down, to be sure. Guess who lived here?
Christians is what you're
The
saying.
Christians lived there. So Nero was able to publicly broadcast, or let it become known, the Christians did it. The Christians did it. Now, bear in mind, in Rome, Christians were noted for their caring, for their love for each other, for the fact that they didn't break the law, that they followed the rules, and in fact didn't just take care of themselves, but materially aided other Roman citizens. But Nero was able to convince them that the Christians did it. And I got news for you. When Christians were persecuted, or like when anyone else was, I suppose, it was not pretty. Nero the main road into Rome was the Appian Way, one of the main roads. Nero had the streets, all the Christians were rounded up. And Nero had the streets lined with more or less crosses. And what he did was he took Christians and wrapped them in a wicker basket and covered the wicker basket with tar and pitch and oil and other flammable items and attached them to the poles and lit the Christians on fire so that human torches lighted the Appian Way and various other routes through the city. And that was a fairly minor persecution. There you go. Thank you, Al. Can you imagine that? I mean, I mentioned this last week. I mean, we get all hot and bothered when people call us stupid for believing in Christ. These people, we are told, there are stories told, sang hymns while this was happening. They didn't fight back. They didn't kick. They didn't scratch because they felt like it was an honor to be treated like Christ. It was an honor to be martyred in His name. And we're going to get more of that as we go forward.
What did the banners say, David?
I can't read them, frankly, but the banners originally, we're told, said, this is a Christian who burned Rome, who burned our city. Something like that. I mean, but that's what happened. And they were lined all up and down the Appian Way. Young, old, male, female, children. None were accepted, regardless of age or sex. None were accepted. Paul is easily, was that next slide, Paul? Yeah. Yeah, of course, I have no idea if Paul looked like that. I wasn't there. They didn't have any photographs, and this is another little rabbit trail. There were no sculptures of the apostles made when they were living. Why? One of the arguments from non-believers, even archaeologists and historians and so forth, are there are no likenesses that were made of David, Solomon, Jesus, all these guys. And there weren't. Why? Can you think of a good reason why?
Recognition.
Well, no.
Become idols?
10 Commandments. Thou shalt not make any graven image. Duh. That's why there aren't any, because they were commanded in the main tenets of the law not to make any. Why? Because it was feared that we, being what we are, would come to venerate the man and not the mission. And has that happened? Of course it has. In Rome, the Caesars ultimately demanded to be worshipped as gods. And that's one of the main problems that the Jews and the Christians had with them, and caused persecution beyond belief that we'll talk about another week. It's the same reason why there are no seriously ancient copies of the Old Testament. When the Old Testament came about, scribes initially, or later on, their job became to make copies of Holy Scripture. And they had various places where they did that, most attached to the temple or somewhere nearby, to make copies. Now, they took their job extremely seriously. And they had like 27 different rules that they had to follow while making those parchment copies. Only so many columns, only so many letters per row. They had to locate the middle of the Bible, or they had to know where the middle letter of their copy was in the manuscript. It was very exacting. And if a man that was making this handwritten copy made a mistake, the entire page had to be destroyed and begun again. Because they were writing God's words. They took it very seriously. And every copy was exactly the same as the one before. So, when a copy got old, they put it, I forget what it was called, the Hebrew word for it, but they put it in a closet, and they left them there until somebody would go out and burn them and dispose of them. They didn't need an ancient copy because they knew the one they had in front of them was as good as the one that was given to Moses on the Mount. They knew it because of the exacting ways that it had to be copied. Now Paul, of course, And by the way, did anybody see the movie Paul that came out recently? If you didn't, it's a good one. You ought to. It's a good one. I don't know how much of it's true.
Is that when he's in prison, that one, or is that another?
Well, this is, yeah, and the movie as well. Jim Caviezel, the guy that played Christ in the Passion, he plays Luke in the movie. I don't know who the old guy is that plays Paul, but they're really very good, and I think it's reasonably close because it's a Christian production company. Which, by the way, Christian production companies are doing much better than they used to. Christian movies used to be terrible, but anyway, Paul is the great evangelist to the Gentiles. And again, we look at Paul, or at least in our imagination, see him wandering the Near East and starting churches and all that. But that's not what he did. That's not what he did. He went to places to help, to teach, to raise other disciples, knowledgeable disciples. And we talked about this briefly last week too. This to me is amazing because this was a Jew of the Jews. And if ever you wanted evidence of somebody, he went up to Damascus preaching the gospel and had never met another apostle. And he had the same gospel that they were preaching. That's pretty amazing to me. But Paul's greatest legacy that has touched millions of people, it's not where he went, what he did, who he talked to, how Ephesus responded to him or didn't respond to him. That's kind of a sideshow. What's great about Paul is what he left us down through the centuries. Paul's writings are what made Paul. And I've said before, I thank Paul because in Romans, he let me know who I am. And if you read Romans, he'll let you know who you are too. And that later, centuries later, is how the Reformation basically came about. But last week I said when Christ comes again, it's not going to be a judgment, it's going to be a sentencing. Because we're already judged. And we should be. And Paul lays that out in Romans. Now the great news is, this is my favorite guy. This guy lets us know who Jesus Christ is. And why we can count on salvation through him and what he did. In 48, this was long, man, we're backing up. In 48, the year 48, there was a council in Jerusalem, obviously before it was destroyed. There was a council amongst all the apostles and the elders, and Paul included, Barnabas, you can read about this, to determine what and how to let Gentiles into the church. Now, it had already been witnessed that Paul was bringing them to Christ. So they knew that the power of the Spirit was working, but they didn't know how it was going to mix with Judaism. And we talked a little bit about the Judaizers last week. So in this council, they ultimately agreed, and this is included in Acts as well, that help widows, help orphans, abstain from blood etc., and we'll welcome the Gentiles. But from 33, which give or take a year or so, I don't know that anybody knows for sure, was the time that Christ was killed, buried, and resurrected, and the Pentecost, the arrival of the Holy Spirit. For that 15 years, there wasn't much going on with the Gentiles that we know of. Now, I don't know if there was a small congregation in Buzzards Roost, Syria, that allowed some Gentiles to come in. I don't know about that, but officially, that's how they were allowed into the church. And interestingly enough, so many Gentiles flocked into the church that the original church from Jerusalem became irrelevant and things moved on elsewhere. Okay. Last thing. And I always had struggled with how to say this. Today, and I'm not saying right or wrong or otherwise. I'm just stating a fact. Today, all anyone has to do is sit in the back pew, hear something that touches their heart, run down the aisle and say, "I believe," and they're saved. At least that's how we act. That's what we believe. Okay? Whether they are or not, I don't know. I do know that there are a lot of people that have had that experience and have never darkened the door of a church again. I do know that there are people that have that experience and they come to church on Easter and Christmas because they want to make their mothers happy. Now, I'm not indicting those people because they know between them and God whether they're saved or not. I don't know. It's not my business to know. But initially, when a Gentile wanted to enter the church, and we did mention this last week, they would go through between a year and 3 years training. And go back a slide. Can you do that, Al? I had somebody ask me once.
Back to that, or?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. I had somebody ask me once, well, it doesn't say anything about that in the Bible, to go through training. True, it doesn't. The Bible, however, was talking about Jews and the Messiah arriving for the Jews initially. Jews first, Gentiles later. The Bible also is the fulfillment of the Jewish Old Testament. No mention of Gentiles, okay? So, no, it doesn't say you should have to go through a year or 2 or 3 of school. First of all, I would ask you a rhetorical question. How much better shape do you think the church would be in today if we had gone through a year or 2 of church training before we were allowed into the church? Personally, I think the church would be a lot stronger today instead of disappearing before our eyes. That's my personal opinion. Another reason it was done was because of this. It was only fair that they let people know what they were in for. It was only fair that they taught people, because this is what they potentially had to look forward to, and countless hundreds of thousands did give their lives over the centuries. Literally hundreds of thousands.
It's still going on today.
It is indeed. It is indeed. Except here, where we're fat, dumb, and happy. But, not that I'm asking for it, mind you, but they owed it to their fellow Christians to know what they were getting into. Not only that, for a matter of just pure self-protection. They wanted to make sure that a new member knew what they were facing and were willing to accept it, because they didn't want someone that was just on the outskirts, turning in or revealing all the Christians to the authorities when this happened again. It was for self-protection as well. Because remember, these Christians certainly went to their fate, and believe me, it sounds unreal, but many of them not only accepting it, but they went willingly. Willingly. But they had children too. And as much as you possibly can, you want to protect your children, and certainly Christians are no different in that regard than anyone else. So that's why the catechumate, the teaching, the schooling went on. One of the reasons. Okay? It's kind of a rabbit trail too. But it's also why, got 2 minutes. It's also why there is talk of the church, Yakima, and the kingdom. Which is bigger, normally? Kingdom, right? There are some church fathers who say that the kingdom is composed of all the people that profess Christ. The church is composed of those people who meant it. That should give us all pause. Because one of the things that we know is that we were put here for only one reason. To get to know, worship, and share Christ. That is the only meaning we have. Period. So, and again, I'm in this canoe right along with you. If this is why we were put here, that this is why we were created by God, and this is for those folks that just profess, and this is for those who meant it, if you meant it, what does meaning it mean? Again, this is a rhetorical question. Everybody has to search their own souls for this.
We should fruit from it.
There should be some fruit. Absolutely, Brian. I believe that's true, and well, we're told that. A lot of parables, but I think it's pretty obvious that if this is why we were created and we're living for that, there's going to be fruit. And this
Well,
is
you mentioned Pedro, that's what happened to that church.
exactly. Well, and Bill, I couldn't agree with you more. How much of the outside pagan world is influencing our church today? The same cultural demographics, the same percentages are true in the church as outside the church. No one can tell the difference in us. So they go, why do I want to give this up? Not that anyone has to give up anything, but why do I want to give up this lifestyle if the same things happen to all these people? That's grist for another mill, for sure. That's not what we're here to discuss. But that's what we're living through in our day. I mean, if I did a class once where it was a room, well, it was a little larger than this, but it was a room like this, and I put cardboard in the windows, okay? So that when I turned the lights out, it was like Luray Caverns. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Y'all ever go down the caverns? You literally lose all sense of direction. You don't know if you're up, down, left, right. Did the same thing. I said, this is the world without Christians. And at that time I had a flip phone. I flipped my phone open, and you know how pale the light is off one of those. I said, it barely lighted up a corner, just enough so that you didn't trip over the furniture. I said, and this is what we are now. This is what we are now. I don't know, and I don't mean to burden you with this stuff. I mean, I'm burdened with it, so I guess I'm just putting it on you. So there. But anyway, I realized we got down a rabbit trail a little bit, and it is 6:30, and I'm going to be true to my word. But we're going to start tomorrow, or next week, with now we have the churches scattered. We've set the, Jerusalem has gone the way they're going to go. Go to the last one. That shouldn't have been there. Isn't there one just before this?
The first one we saw?
Okay, no, I didn't include it. Never mind. My bad. It's okay. It was my mistake, Al. You're awesome, man.
Any significance between the right angle?
I don't know, man. I'm gonna have to,
That's just,
hey. I don't know if that's a quadrilateral or, I'm not sure this is the right angle.
That's 89 degrees, can't you tell
I
that?
mean, anyway, I don't know if there's any, one of the reasons why I really didn't want to use this is because I felt certain that someone was going to start talking Bermuda Triangle on me. And I didn't even want to go there. And if anyone would, Brian, you would.
the creek's right in the middle of it.
But we'll start getting into where the church went from its roots. But I think it's important to remember its roots. But from there, what went on in Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome, and how it became what it is today. Okay? Bill, would you lead us in prayer before we go, please?
Why don't we hold hands?
Okay.
He's
I like that.
He's a
A hand holder.
There's nothing wrong with it.
No.
On his shoulder.
Father, thank you so much for the people that love you, Father, and I pray that what David is telling us, we will understand that and grab that, Father, and that I love to feel the love and divine presence that you give to us, Father. I pray that we all can feel that, Father, and that we can share that, Father. This world needs to see you and understand you, Father, and I pray that that growth will continue throughout the world and in your body of the church, Father. And thank you so much for your Son, Jesus Christ, and thank you for David and what he brings to us. In your Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.